Welcome back to this Christmas weekend edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Joining us now from the Clarion Project, National Security Analyst Ryan Mauro is on with us. Ryan, welcome back to the program. How are you doing? And I hope you're having a Merry Christmas season.
Yes, I am. Thanks so much for having me on, and looking forward to Christmas.
There's so much going on, what do they say, target-rich environment. But I want to begin with this investigation federal government is looking into, maybe for the first time in a decade, a jihadi cult operating in do I understand this correct? They're operating inside the United States?
Yes, this is one of those things where your listeners are going to go online to check everything I say because they're not going to believe I'm telling the truth. But there is a group that I refer to as the Jihadi cult, originally named Jamaat al-Fuqra, but now they use the name Muslims of the Americas because it's just a more fashionable term and it makes it harder to criticize them. Mm-hmm. But what they are famous for, aside from their acts of terrorism between the 80s into the mid-90s, and perhaps since then, but those are the ones that we know for a fact, is really they're most known for buying up these plots of land, and they make what they call Islamic villages, which are autonomous areas, enclaves, that are radical, sometimes even offer basic guerrilla training to members, and act as isolated Sharia-based communes across the U.S. They say they have 22 of them. The headquarters actually has a sign outside of it that says, "Welcome to Holy Islamburg" in upstate New York. It's 70 acres large, and this is the group that I specialize in because I just find them incredibly fascinating and also very dangerous. And through a series of communications I had with one of the agencies of the federal government of the U.S., they did say to me in a letter that they acknowledge there are ongoing investigations into this group, probably related to felons getting guns and weapons trafficking and that type of thing. But that's at least one agency confirming ongoing investigations, while this group is out there claiming to be moderate and running candidates for political office and getting the love of the media.
My God. So yep. Now, we hear people run around and they say, "Oh no, that's just a school. That's just like your Catholic school. It's a parochial school. It's a madrasa. It's not what you think, and you're being told lies and the nationalists and Trump and blah blah blah." And even during the Obama administration, they would run, and that was always their defense. But this seems like it goes way beyond even some of the things we've seen here in Virginia, where you've got these madrasas behind huge fences and invisible to anyone but those who are allowed in.
Yeah, in most cases, and this isn't really the most academic answer to give you, but in most cases, if it seems creepy, there's a reason it's creepy. That's just been my experience. Now, of course, there are mosques and Islamic religious schools where people will say, I really think that that's part of some terrorist apparatus, and I look into it and I find no evidence, or I find lies being made up, and that is a serious problem. That type of genuine anti-Muslim bigotry that exists is a problem, but that shouldn't blind us to the fact that we do have a radical Islamic infrastructure in the U.S., and this group is just perhaps the best example of it because they actually name their villages things like Islamburg and Islamville and Ahmadabad, and so you can't really argue with it. And their extremism is so blatant. They follow, just like a cult would, they follow a spiritual leader in Pakistan named Sheikh Jelani, who's about to die, who basically denies the Holocaust and does all of these things that Trump supporters are regularly accused of doing but actually aren't. And so he's, in my opinion, a racist, a sexist, a criminal, a crook, all of that. And this group views him as essentially being the incarnation of God almost, and a figure in apocalyptic prophecy. So you have an apocalyptic cult that is linked to jihadism on American soil. And I've got to tell you, in Virginia, they've got two really big compounds that are very active.
Well, and I want to follow up on that. Ryan Mauro from the Clarion Project and his piece, and we're going to put it up on our social media as well, detailing all this. Talk about this this group's MOA, the Muslims of America, and what they're doing in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Tell us what's afoot here, because I can't shake the idea that if somebody, and I'm saying this way because it's happened, takes radical Christian teachings and sets up a cult-like compound, Branch Davidians, we would be fairly anxious to burn the place down with children in the basement, but yet we seem like we act like, oh no, we can't go in there, we can't go talk to them, even though that from what I'm reading in your piece, the NCIS folks have even reported gunfire coming from inside these cult compounds.
Yeah, I've got video of gunfire coming from Islamberg around 2002. I've got video that the group filmed themselves that then ended up in my hands, showing the women getting guerrilla training. That's at the headquarters, and such training has also gone on at both compounds in Virginia, in Red House and Meherrin, and then they have all sorts of operatives who live outside of those communes who do things like run convenience stores or just have regular jobs but are active in the group, from Lynchburg to other places in Virginia outside of the camps themselves. The latest development that has happened in regards to this group that didn't get any coverage is that the leader of one of their security companies, a standard MO that they use is to use a security company as a front, but the leader of one of their security companies ran for office in Virginia. He ran for the Virginia House of Delegates, lost, probably going to run again because these guys don't quit. And just yesterday, a woman in Massachusetts announced her congressional run, and she's the general counsel for this group. But the media decided not to Google her name, I guess, or they didn't care, and she just got all this flattering coverage and was never asked anything about, like, how she posted an article by her leader in Pakistan saying that the Holocaust happened because the Jews and Hitler had mutual animosity and the Jews basically conned us into getting into World War II. Somehow that just doesn't get mentioned, even though I've reported on it several times, and it's one of the first Google search results you get with her name.
That's amazing that this isn't even stuff that, I guess that's the brazenness of this, Ryan. This isn't even necessarily stuff. Now we'll get into some of the stuff that you've been able to unearth through declassified documents and everything, but this is stuff that you can just find on the general Google searches.
Right, because of the work that myself and others have done in trying to expose this group, because some of it's easy and it's very rewarding when you see the gravity of what this group has done, even just in terms of radicalism and criminal activity. So the central website where I store my research on this group, and it's only a percentage of what I have yet to upload, but if you go to this website, still a big database, it's called fuqrafiles.com, Fuqra files.com, and there's a section where you can look up and see what this group is doing in your state. And the section on Virginia is very long because they've done a lot there. Members have been arrested for giving guns to felons that remain part of the group. There have been terrorists, people actually linked to terrorist plots who have gone and hid there and then been caught there at the camps or just outside of them because you have to have plausible deniability. They're not stupid. A whole range of criminal activity being linked there. Security companies, like I mentioned. They've even infiltrated local law enforcement, according to the declassified documents I had. The guy that handled security for the Red House compound worked for a police department.
That's stunning to me. You're talking about running for the Virginia General Assembly. I guess the transgender member is not as worrisome as if this radical group starts to get members elected. But this is a police officer. It's a Virginia police officer who's a member of this radicalized Muslims of America group in Red House, and their chief of security, Ryan?
As of 2004, yes, that is what was the case according to the government documents that were declassified and passed along to me. And I would assume that when you have a scheme like that going on, you continue it. So if that guy is left, then I'm sure they have someone else in there, and they're always encouraging their members to join law enforcement. You see that at every single one of their villages across the country. It's their MO. So that's definitely going on. But they're advanced criminals. Their members are going back and forth to Pakistan, Trinidad, Venezuela, and elsewhere. We don't know what goes on there, but we do have credible information from my own sources in the group and from these same documents that they get more advanced guerrilla training when they go to Pakistan, these other places, and sometimes link up with other terrorist groups. So this acts as a conduit into the overall global jihadi network.
So was there a period of time, say, from 2008 to, I don't know, presumably somewhere around 2016, where perhaps the government wasn't so interested in looking into these folks? Because it seems like, you have information that NCIS and these folks, and I'm sorry, I just keep seeing Gibbs smacking somebody in the back of the head every time I say NCIS. But it seems like all this seems to end right around 2008. Did they lose interest in this group for any given reason in that period of time?
The impression I get is that the Obama administration, thanks to political correctness and really just a change in how they looked at the Islamic extremist threat, did curtail their investigations into this group. I've had multiple law enforcement sources tell me that basically the orders they got was that if you have specific evidence of criminal activity by a specific member of the group, then yeah, go ahead and investigate them and arrest them if you get a chance to do it. But you can't investigate the group as a whole just for people having extremist beliefs, because that's protected by the Constitution, and I think that that's just crazy. You can't prosecute someone for those beliefs, but it should be a starting point to say this is a group that we need to monitor and have a database of their names and see what checks out. The group itself believed that once the Obama administration came in, that they had at least minimal scrutiny of themselves. They would say this almost openly in public and also behind closed doors where my sources were. So I think there's truth to what you suspect, but some investigations of specific members in different states did continue, so not all of it was lost. But it got so bad that the woman who is running for Congress now in Massachusetts was actually invited into the White House by the Justice Department for a meeting to celebrate activists that promote American pluralism and freedom of religion and tolerance. And she got invited.
Hold it. You mean the group that will kill you because you're not part of their religion is being celebrated for celebrating religious tolerance?
We have a lot of examples of that, yes. Now, what the group would say is, well, we don't condone violence, and when was the last time we tried to carry out a terrorist attack on American soil? And so, to be fair, we don't know of this group specifically orchestrating a terrorist attack on American soil. We know that they've talked about fighting law enforcement if they come in and raid their compounds, so then you have like 22 Wacos all in the same day. But they would argue that they've only had a handful of members that engage in terrorist activities, and they're not involved in that anymore if they ever were. So that's what the advocates of the group will say, like people in the media. But what is totally inarguable is the fact that they're under investigation by several government agencies. They have a terrorist history, an openly extremist, bigoted history, and they're running for political office and getting political favors, and one of their top members even got into the Obama White House at the invitation of the Justice Department, and they've been using that to promote themselves as moderate good guys ever since.
And that's the frightening thing is in our world of guilt by association, there's also endorsement by association, and the more mainstream you make yourself look, it's almost like a plot to some bizarre retelling of The Godfather, where he was trying to buy his way into heaven by, associating himself with the Catholic Church. But the danger in this is, to me, that these are groups that are specifically targeting all of the things that we love about this country and that are special about this country, specifically because they exist, because there's freedom of religion, there's tolerance, there's equality amongst the sexes and those sorts of things that they find just intolerable. But it's not enough that they might live in a particularly monastic way and and their wives succumb to Sharia and they're fine with it, but they want to enforce that on everyone else.
And they enforce it upon their own members. We know that from their own documents where they've had pictures of people getting whipped. And I know people who have been whipped by this group because they used to belong to it or are currently in it, doing things like watching TV when they weren't allowed to. Like it's just ridiculous what goes on inside these enclaves. And I'm sure there's a lot going on that I don't know about because I only have so many sources. But the example you gave about the mafia cozying up to churches and as a means of money laundering and getting legitimacy it's a very good example for what we're talking about here, because after this group's image got really tarnished, it was resurrected through two methods. The first was they started operating under a new name, the United Muslim Christian Forum. So they became an interfaith group and got endorsements from idiotic pastors and priests.
Really?
And that was their new offensive. Then the second thing is that there were genuine anti-Muslim terrorists that tried to blow up their headquarters, Islamburg, which, I mean, if I ever found out about that, I'd report to the authorities to do everything I could to stop that. But that allowed them to accurately say in that context they're a victim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, the danger is now, we tend to take this eye for an eye, ironically, approach. Where I and I know you and I have talked about this, and other members of the Clarion Project have talked about this. Michael Del Rosso, it's the grappling, defining issue of this era is how do we empower the Muslims that just want to go on with their lives and be freely following their religion in this country versus the ones who want to bring down this country to create a theocracy the same way they do in every other country they're in. Is this idea that this, instead of struggle, as I've been told by other Muslim leaders, there is this battle between whether jihad means war or struggle, whether it's external or internal. How are we, it seems like it's even getting worse, Ryan, in this country, and how we're grappling with this.
I think politically we're advancing a little bit, but it's mind-bogglingly slow to the point where now using terms like Islamic extremism that's permitted now. That's acceptable. But now trying to understand why extremists exist and why they engage in jihad and what jihad is, now we're still focused on that. And these are all things that we should have learned as a society within a year after 9/11. These are debates that have been stuck and frozen in time for way too long. But for the question of embracing Muslims, it's easy to identify the ones that are really patriotic. If they are advancing Western values, separation of mosque and state, fighting against theocracy, and paying a price for it, then they're a good person. Judge them based on their behavior and what they've sacrificed, just like you would anyone else as part of a vetting system. And if we had a government that understood that and gave a platform to such Muslims, we'd be facing a very different situation right now. But we don't have that because right now the radicals are backed by rich folks in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and elsewhere. And the progressive Muslims that want to reform the faith, they got nothing. I mean, they don't have a bank account. They have no one backing them. They don't have these big fundraisers or anything. But there are a dozen Muslim organizations that rallied together in the U.S. and Canada who called on the State Department in 2012 to review this jihadi cult for designation as a foreign terrorist organization. The reason that's significant is because people always say, well, how can this be allowed to operate, especially if you know they've engaged in illegal activity? Well, it's because they're viewed as a domestic group. My argument is, according to the State Department's own criteria, they qualify as a foreign terrorist organization. A dozen Muslim organizations agreed with my assessment and are calling on the government to review possible designation of this radical extremist Islamic group that also threatens them as well as us and everyone listening.
And it threatens their own faith. I'm glad to see that these Muslim groups are coming out to try to clarify and sanctify their own position in this country, because you would think of all the countries on all of God's green earth, this would be the one that a Muslim would want to celebrate because it allows for religious freedom. But as with often the case, you talked about the whys and how do they recruit. I mean, it doesn't seem all that different. I talked to drug enforcement agents who talk about how MS-13 recruits mules and how the mafia recruits muscle and that kind of thing as they go into the poorest communities, the most disenfranchised communities, and offer franchise for it. And I really think that it may not be the silver bullet, but a big part of it is going to be a better economy in America and maybe less fertile recruiting grounds for these kind of groups.
Sure. Definitely cracking down on that type of criminal activity and really investing in the resources necessary and giving law enforcement the freedom as well as the information that they need in order to act is very important. I train law enforcement across the country, and at just about every single session that I give, when I provide information about radical mosques in their backyard, or specifically this group actually having compounds that are dozens of acres large, most personnel that I talk to living right next to it don't know it exists. Or if they know it exists, they've been told that they're moderates who are being slandered by the bigoted press. And these are not police officers that are inclined to think that way. They're very realistic in most cases. But they believe it because they're not policy wonks. They're very, very busy. They're focused on the crimes in front of them. And that's viewed as being a federal job when it comes to counterterrorism, and the information sharing is not happening. But when I train local law enforcement what to look for and what's in their backyard, things do happen, because some of the best intelligence finds that you have, and sometimes the best way to foil a terrorist plot, is just by pulling a guy over and seeing what's in his car.
Unbelievable. Yeah. And you said something that I have to touch on, Ryan Mauro, from the Clarion Project. You talked about sharing of information. And I remember the Patriot Act and its creation, and we've got now this Department of Homeland Security. And all of that was supposed to change. This Department of Homeland Security was supposed to be the end of this balkanized, no information sharing amongst law enforcement. Yet it at very worst seems further apart, and even in a best case scenario probably seems about the same as it was in 2004.
Yeah, I get different accounts. I get some people that say that when it works, it's very impressive and it works in ways that never would have pre-9/11. Then there's others who say, look, there's basically no difference here. It's just changing the name of procedures and it's all bureaucratic. So I get different opinions on that. In my direct experience, what I've seen is that when the fusion centers, where the different agencies come together as part of a task force and they share information, it works very effectively. But that's usually on the federal level, maybe the state level. It won't filter down to the local level. And to me, the local level is actually the most important.
Amen.
But for security purposes, they say, well, in order to protect our sources and stuff, we can't share this information with local law enforcement. But they go way overboard with that.
Ryan, thank you so much for taking this out again. Find it online. We'll post the link up to your work as well. And have a very Merry Christmas, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you and yours have a very Merry Christmas. We will see you again as we approach the new year and a new outlook, or just more of the same. Until then, for everyone here, so long and thanks for all the fish.